Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I'm Hui Kai, Head of Content Division at WuXi AppTec. On behalf of my colleagues around the world, welcome to the third episode of our new webinar series, Collaborations That Transform. We launched this series back in May, starting with neurofibromatosis, then hemophilia in July, and today we'll focus on spinal muscular atrophy, also called SMA, to honor the August SMA Awareness Month. We have much to celebrate for SMA. Just a few days ago, on August 7th, FDA accelerated the approval of risdiplam, the first oral drug for SMA. This means that in less than 5 years from the first gene therapy in 2016, SMA patients now have 3 leading treatment options across 3 different modalities: gene therapy, antisense, and small molecule. Today's webinar will feature leading clinicians, drug developers, patients, and nonprofit foundations from US and Europe. The discussions will focus on how we can collectively advance innovation towards what matters to patients most. And our first session features Paulo Fontoura, Global Head of and SVP of Neuroscience and Rare Disease at Roche. And this session is moderated by David Chen, CEO of WuXi Advanced Therapies.
So this is David Chen. I'm head of the WuXi Advanced Therapy Unit. I'm the CEO. It's my great pleasure and honor to have the invitation chance to talk to Dr. Paulo Fontoura, Global Head and SVP of Neuroscience and Rare Disease Clinical Development at Roche, to share his perspective on the challenging for the global development and the access to the medicine in the rare disease. So Paulo, it's my great honor, pleasure to talk to you.
No, thanks, David. It's really a pleasure to be able to be here.
Thank you. So my first question, Paulo, for you is, so what's your vision of the neuroscience at the Roche?
Well, neuroscience is the fastest area of growth in our pipeline right now. Roche has a long tradition of working in neuroscience. We developed the benzodiazepines in the 70s and the 60s, the first drug for Parkinson's. But in the last decade or so, it has been the focus of a renewed investment and interest in the company. And I think the reasons for that have to do, on one hand, with the tremendous medical need for new and better therapies for neuroscience and neurological disorders generally. At the same time, there's tremendous investment in terms of science, technology, new understandings of disease biology. And when you put all of that together, we see this really as a huge opportunity for us as a global pharmaceutical company to come out with really transformative medicines, things that would change the way that patients can live. Essentially, they can be who they are.
So inspiring. Thank you so much. My second question for you is, why and also how does the Roche commit and support the rare disease franchise comparing to other established franchise like oncology? And also, how do the rare disease fit into the neuroscience franchise under your the supervision?
Right. That is a really important question. And one thing that a lot of people are actually not aware of is that our experience in oncology has actually prepared us really well to work in rare diseases. A lot of the diseases in oncology, or a lot of rare cancers, have already taught us a lot about how to do drug development in a different way, including working with health authorities to get breakthrough designations, working with patient groups, etc. So we were, in essence, already doing rare diseases for quite a while. Now, recently, what we thought was that our primary mission, which is to follow the science to develop transformative medicines, fits perfectly into the rare diseases space. And we see it very, very much that the personalization of healthcare, so personalized healthcare is one of the core themes of Roche. It actually ultimately means treating all patients, all diseases as rare diseases. And so I think both in terms of culture, ethos, the type of science we like to do, that's how we see it. Now in neuroscience specifically, the way I see rare diseases are as the cutting edge of science. They're the tip of the spear, if you want. And that's because for rare diseases, the majority of them are genetically caused. And therefore we have really deep understanding of the biology, which allows us then to develop medicines that are very, very targeted. My hope is that by doing that and by continuing to understand the biology in more common diseases like Alzheimer's or Parkinson's or stroke, we'll get to a point where we can apply the same approach there as well. So in essence, I see rare diseases as really fundamentally important, not just as a mix of a pipeline, but also in the way that it pushes forward, the science and our ability to develop better medicines.
Great, thank you so much. I think that's a great segue to the next question that I'd like to check in with you. I think Roche has a very, very proud history of transforming the life of those who had a rare disease, such as like a non-Hodgkin lymphoma, the cystic fibrosis, hemophilia, or growth hormone deficiency. I think through the partnership with the PTC, right, the company is working on the SMA, which is the focus of this webinar. So what area of focus does Roche have in the rare disease space, and how this SMA pipeline at the Roche is shaping up?
So, I think SMA in lots of ways is really exemplary of this concept of following the science or taking scientific breakthroughs to develop medicines. Since the understanding of the genetics of SMA until now, where patients have 3 available therapies, it took literally just over a decade, which is remarkable, really remarkable in terms of pharmaceutical development. So I see this as an example that we want to follow. And therefore, we are looking for similar types of indications where we can have a similar approach. So, for example, our work in Duchenne's muscular dystrophy or other rare muscle disorders follows that. Our work in rare forms of autism, etc., follows that pattern. So in essence, we're always looking for areas or for conditions in which the biology is really well understood. And now we have a new technology that can really impact that. For SMA specifically, of course, as I said, it's great news for patients worldwide to have 3 available therapies, but we know there's much more to be done. And especially, I think, in the areas of muscle regeneration and regrowth, and essentially trying to overcome fixed disabilities. A lot of the patients, actually the majority, the most prevalent patient population are people that have, unfortunately, progressed to the point where they're either wheelchair bound or they're very disabled. I would love for us to be able to do something more for those patients as well.
Thank you so much for sharing. Maybe I switch gear to talk about how to make this happen. So in your opinion, what tend to be our industrial limitation and challenge in the rare disease clinical development?
Well, a lot of the times, I think most of the challenges have to do with the unknown, right? So a lot of the rare diseases have not really been the focus of clinical development or pharmaceutical development. And therefore, when you start working and you need things like validated endpoints or an approved regulatory path, quite often you don't have it. And that means you have to be really thoughtful and from the beginning already start building the things you don't have. So conducting natural history studies or endpoint validation studies. And that means also a different way of thinking, right? Which implies much more collaboration. You have to reach out into the community, whether that's the patient community, the academic community, the regulatory agencies, to create that partnership, because it's in everybody's interest that those things, that infrastructure for research gets done. So if you don't have that, then I think that is a tremendous limitation right now.
I see. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Maybe along the same line, right? So what have the regulatory agency done well so far? And also what more or differently could they do in your viewpoint?
Well, I really applaud the work that regulatory agencies play here. And of course, different agencies in different territories have had different approaches, but I think the common pattern has been, on one hand, the recognition that rare diseases need to be treated somewhat differently, and therefore you need to allow for more agility in development, and which does not mean by any means reducing the bar or lowering the bar on the quality of data or on safety standards. That's not at all. But sometimes you can move faster. Sometimes you can generate enough evidence to get approval and get to patients quicker and continue to generate evidence on the market, which I think is something that the regulatory agencies have been very open to. And, you know, the creation of designations like fast track, breakthrough designation, you know, prime designation, etc. All of these are mechanisms that regulatory agencies have put in place that actually are really, really helpful. So if you as a pharmaceutical company now want to approach a new rare disease, provided your data is good and you're doing the right things, my experience has been that the regulators are usually very willing to work with you to create the right path so that you get the faster that you can get to market. We made our submission to the FDA November last year based on really preliminary data. And in the middle of the review, we had more data coming out. And the FDA basically said, can we see those data as well? Because then we can broaden your label. And typically they don't do this. You submit and that's it, they're done. So they allowed us to submit more data as they were reviewing the data, which is totally, you know, outside of bounds. And then they reviewed that extra data to give us the label we eventually have, which is a wonderful label. So it's been not only faster, but much more flexible than usually is done.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing your point of view. Now maybe switch gear to another interesting but important topic about the access to those medicine, right? So what is Roche doing to ensure patients worldwide get access to those very important drugs in a rare disease, of course, SMA in particular? Yeah.
Right. Well, I think, you know, again, it starts with being very thoughtful at the beginning. Access has, in my mind, two main limitations. Usually one of them has to do with not having the data that you need to, so that payers worldwide can see the value that this new medicine brings. And on the other hand, it has to do with, you know, local healthcare structures and things like that. Now, one thing we're definitely doing is that we're putting a lot of investment up front in terms of generating the data that's required. For example, in our program for SMA, that meant doing trials globally, going to all these different countries and generating data with local physicians and local centers, so that at the end, when we submit a market, you know, authorization application, we have data that people can recognize and locally can look at. And I think that facilitates a lot. Of course, Roche is a big global player, so we take advantage of that. I mean, it's something we can bring our experience in developing and launching and making drugs accessible worldwide. And of course, then the second thing is that we always want to partner with the local community, with the local payers, to find the best solutions that provide sustainable access. Our ideal goal actually is that between regulatory approval and access, the minimal amount of time passes, right? So you want to have a drug that's approved with a great label, with a great benefit risk, and at the same time with the market access solutions that enable patients to get real access to that drug.
Thank you so much. My last question is, so what's your thinking and view about those advanced therapy, the regenerative medicine in gene therapy, they could contribute and then make a difference in those treatment in rare disease?
Well, I think it depends a lot on which condition you're talking about, right? Again, it's what's the medicine supposed to do? The simplest example to think about is a disease like hemophilia or SMA or Duchenne's, where you have a genetic defect, you have a missing protein, and then essentially you use one of these new technologies to replace that, right? So it's kind of the genetic replacement therapy. That's conceptually relatively simple, even though it's much more complicated when you actually want to do it. But in that case, you could legitimately think, as long as I put the missing protein back, I'll get the clinical benefit, right? And presumably, again, provided your technology is stable and works for the duration, for essentially for the life of that patient, you can then think about curative therapies. Okay, so again, conceptually, you could say, if I replace the missing factor VIII gene, right, with a normal factor VIII gene in the liver of patients with hemophilia, and that gene functions for 5 decades, I've cured hemophilia in that patient. Now, of course, you and I know that it's not that simple, because you need stable transmission, you need stable transduction, it needs to function at the same level all the time. Maybe not every patient will react the same way, so it gets more complicated. But at least conceptually, it's relatively simple. Where I think it gets really, really complicated is when you try to do other things with genetic medicines, right? So you try to either introduce a new gene or a new product that doesn't exist, like a therapeutic antibody, and there are companies doing that. Or you want to modify T cells to make them do different things, like with CAR T cells, and then it becomes more complex, right? But I think there's great promise in the whole field of cell and gene therapy, if you want, because at least now, for the first time, we've had the first examples of such therapies being developed and actually demonstrating their value. Okay.
Yeah. Beyond SMA, right? There are several thousand of the rare disease, only a fraction of the rare disease we have some kind of treatment, right? A good portion of which are far from perfect. And also for the majority of those rare disease, there's just no cure or treatment at all. So what could be done to better closing this gap from the Roche experience and also perspective?
I think the fundamentals start with understanding disease biology, frankly. I think if you're looking for innovative therapies, quite often the rate limiting step, the reason why a lot of these conditions have not been treated right now is because of the lack of understanding of what causes those diseases. So I'd say investment in basic research, investment in clinical research, that's fundamental. And that's done not just by pharmaceutical companies, but by academic centers, by governments, etc. The second thing that really, really helps is organization, meaning that getting patient groups, getting academic centers to essentially understand what the local population is. What are the needs for those particular patients and how can we best serve them? And in some way create, again, that infrastructure for research. So then when you do have a candidate medicine, you have a clinical trial network that can execute those trials really, really fast. And I think the more we do of those basic investments in science, in healthcare, et cetera, the easier it will become to develop more medicines.
Great. Thank you so much. I think with the closing, Paulo, do you want to share your thought and advice to the audience who's listened to this, I think about the challenging opportunity for the global development and access to the medicine in the rare disease?
Yes, and maybe I'll take SMA, which is the topic of the seminar, as a great example of what can be done. As I said, since the discovery of the genetic cause of SMA, up until now, literally a decade has passed, and it's remarkable that SMA has gone from a disease that had no treatments and virtually was a really severe disease or sometimes a death sentence to young babies to now a disease that's treatable. And I think a lot of the things that contributed to that outcome are lessons that we can take and apply for other diseases as well. That it means that once you have the right targets in biology and you apply the right technology, be that gene therapy or RNA splicing or antisense, there are ways of modulating biology at a really fundamental level now. So when you put those things together, then you can make great medicines happen and you can change the lives of thousands of patients worldwide. So my advice, and if you want, my call to action is that we should really start taking these opportunities very seriously as an industry. There's so much good that can be done. And we've demonstrated, all of us have demonstrated, if you put those right things together, those elements together, at the end, great medicines are always going to be very useful. They're always going to be great cases for pharmaceutical industry and for healthcare worldwide.
Thank you so much, Paulo. Personally, I was inspired and also excited by the very insightful thought you shared with me and with the audience here, right? And also I personally congratulate and also applauding you and your organization, right? To leading the, exploring the frontier, to exploring all the treatment for the rare disease and the neuroscience part, right? Because we know there's so many patients worldwide are having this unmet medical need to be fulfilled. and looking forward for you and your team continue making the difference and the impact to the world, and patient will eventually benefit from advance based on the science and your the strategic thought. Thank you so much.
Thank you, David. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Paulo, for sharing your perspectives. As you said, it is remarkable that SMA patients now have 3 therapies within just 1 decade. But we know there's much more to be done. So, what other challenges we still face? And how to ensure that innovation is directed towards what matters most to patients? Now let's take a deeper dive. Our next panel of leading experts will provide critical perspectives on putting patients at the center of new drug development. This panel is moderated by Lauren Martz, Senior Editor at Biochemistry.
Hi everyone, my name is Lauren Martz and I'm Senior Editor and Head of Translation and Clinical Development Coverage at Biochemistry. Welcome to the second segment of WuXi's Collaborations That Transform session on SMA. The topic of our discussion is putting patients at the center of accelerating R&D for spinal muscular atrophy. We're lucky enough to get the perspectives of people representing 3 stakeholder groups today. We have a physician, a patient advocate, and a philanthropist who will address the ways that each of their groups are incorporating the patient voice into the drug development process, but also the importance of collaboration across those groups and with other stakeholders in accelerating R&D. So today I'm joined by Laurent Savier, Professor of Pediatric Neuromuscular Disease at MD UK Oxford, Mencia de Lemos Belmonte, President of SMA Europe, and Kristen Schneeman, Program Director of the Faster Cures Center at the Milken Institute. There's been so much progress in the treatment of SMA over the last few years, with advances as recent as earlier this month when the 3rd disease-modifying therapy was approved for the indication. And patients have played an important role in getting to this point. But the focus of our discussion is going to be on the expanded role that patients can play in improving and accelerating drug development, and also to be sure that innovation is directed where it matters most to patients. So to start, I'd like to ask each of our panelists to say a few words about how the work that they're doing is making patients a central focus of R&D. So Kristen, would you like to begin?
Sure, thank you so much for having me as part of this discussion with this distinguished group of speakers. I'm Kristen Schneeman. I'm a director at Faster Cures, which, as you noted, is a center of the Milken Institute. We are a think tank, and we hope a catalyst for action as well, with a very broad mission to try to understand where the bottlenecks are in the biomedical research ecosystem that are slowing progress across all conditions and diseases for all stakeholders. So we don't focus on any particular condition or sector, but really try to identify these challenges and bring stakeholders together to try to address some of them sort of across the usual boundaries that divide us. We have taken a longstanding interest in the role that philanthropy plays in biomedical research, and specifically patient-driven foundations that fund biomedical research. So we've really taken an interest in how foundations can be more strategic and entrepreneurial in their role as funders of medical research and as conduits for patient participation and patient perspective in the whole R&D ecosystem from beginning to end. So we can talk more over the course of this discussion about what we've sort of observed over the last 10 or 15 years in that space, but we've got some really wonderful specific examples in the SMA community right here.
That sounds great, thank you. And Mencia?
Hello, my name is Mencia de Lemos, and I joined the SMA community when 10 years ago I received the diagnosis of my 2 children. They're both living with SMA. And back at that time, we could only try to follow a standard of care to contain the disease progression as much as possible and to promote research with the hope that someday there would be a therapy that could improve the future of people living with SMA. My professional background is in international politics and international relations. So I thought that my way of contributing to look for a better future was to work towards unifying efforts globally to tackle SMA, and got involved on patient organization. I'm today president of SMA Europe, which is the European SMA Patient Organization. We are in fact an umbrella organization that covers 19 organizations across 18 countries in Europe, and we are growing quite fast. We represent patients from most countries of the European Union, like Spain, Italy, France, Germany, Poland, Romania, and also from outside the European Union, like Russia, Ukraine, Switzerland. And our goal, the goal that unifies all of us, is to bring effective therapies to patients and to ensure optimal care across our country. How do we do this? We firstly promote research. So we run a call for research project. We promote scientific exchange by organizing International Congress on SMA and support and participate in different scientific events and workshops. We establish cooperation paths with all the stakeholders, be them regulators, researchers, and healthcare practitioners and pharmaceutical industry. And we raise awareness on the unmet needs of people living with SMA and advocate for patients and treaters of all decisions that affect the lives of those living with SMA.
Thank you so much. And Laurent, how about you?
Yeah, so I work in Oxford, but that's not where my funny name and accent comes from. It comes from Belgium, where I am today, and I still work in Belgium actually. So I work both sides, and so I am a very lucky person because I see children and adults both, and I even see patients before they are born. I'm indeed the leader of the newborn screening in southern Belgium, where we have been pioneering for newborn screening in spinal muscular atrophy. So I start seeing patients at birth before they are actually, they present actually spinal muscular atrophy to initiate treatment before symptoms. I, of course, follow many patients where I provide not only standard of care, but also all these new innovative medications. I've been part in all the trials to validate this medication. And I have two additional interests in spinal muscular atrophy. The first one is to develop innovative outcome measures. So outcome measures that are not just a snapshot of patient's condition by scales that we conduct in the hospital, but using wearable technologies. And the second interest is pregnancy and sexuality in patients with spinal muscular atrophy, but all neuromuscular disease, because now not only patients want to be integrated in the real life, to have a job, to have a treatment, but familial life and affective life is a very important part of life. And how we can help as doctors, physicians, and healthcare provider to make this fantastic experience successful is something that we have worked on with my team over the last years.
Okay, that's great. And I'd love to dig in a little bit to the outcomes measures that you mentioned. So in what ways can incorporating the patient voice change the way that outcome measures are defined for SMA?
Well, we use scales in trials, which means that we ask the patients to perform some task, and we grade this task and give 1, 2, 3 according to how the patients perform, and that's how it works at a population level. The problems are, at first, this is a snapshot assessment of patients, which means that patients may have fatigue. Patients may be in a bad day or in a good day. They have to travel to come to the hospital. It's burdensome, so they can underperform. And you just have one assessment at a very single moment. The second aspect is that it's subjective. And sometimes as a rater, I say, should I rate 1 or 2? I don't know. And the third problem is that there is ceiling effect and floor effect. So I can tell you two very interesting stories about that. I have a patient, she's a painter, and she's a very good painter, and she paints with spinal muscular atrophy. She has type 2, she's 49 years old, and she lost the ability to paint. And she told me losing the ability to paint was much more a disaster than losing the ability to walk, because actually I lost the ability to escape of my body and to explore other places by painting. Um, if you perform a scale on this patient before she lost ability to paint like this, she will score 0. And if you score after, she will score 0. And then she could start a treatment, whatever is this treatment, and she improved and she regained the ability to paint. And the first thing she did was a portrait of everybody in my team. And she ranks amongst the 10 happiest person I know in my life. She still scores 0. So which means that she hasn't lost a point, she hasn't gained a point, and she's probably the most one of the happiest person I know. So she's an excellent responder. Technically, if you look from a scale perspective, she's a non-responder and she's stable. But she has moved from a very happy state to a very unhappy state, and then again a happy one. I've got another story like this. He's a patient with type 1. He was 16 years old, and he was just able to move like this, his finger. And he told me, until the age of 16, I considered myself as a very disabled person, and which is understandable. And then I learned how to code. And by being able to code and to belong to a community of people on the internet, they even didn't know that I was disabled. I was a normal person because I was doing the same than the others. And then I did not consider myself anymore as a disabled person. Then I lost this ability to move my finger like this. And I lost the ability to code. And again, I was a disabled person. The good news is that with one treatment, he recovered this ability to move his finger like this. And again, he was one of the ranking in the 10 happiest person I've met in my life. Technically, he scores 0 on any scale, which means that he's stable and non-responder if you just think in terms of scale. But he's a super responder, and you can definitely not use a drug a better way than for such a patient who is so happy afterwards. Which means that if we just think in terms of our understanding and our scales to rate a single patient without taking into consideration what are really the wishes of these patients, then we will fail to recognize fantastic progress of these patients. If you take a pictures of this guy who is just moving like this, or this lady who is just moving like that, and you show to anybody in the real world, they will say, I don't want to be like this. But these persons, when they are treated and improving, are actually much happier than any person I've met without disability. So which means that there's a real added value of treatment, even if we are not able to quantify these added values by using scale. So a first point is to listen to our patient. What is important for our patients? And certainly being able to identify what is important in the real life for a specific patient is super important. The second point is that if we conduct just scales, we'll have a point assessment of patient. We just see how is the patient at time t, but we don't consider that the patient, he will go out of the hospital and have another life, the real life, and that if we just have a point assessment, we will just concentrate on a very precise time, and it's quite incredible. We perform 6-minute walking test, which means we place 2 cones and we ask the patients who are walkers to walk between the 2 cones. That's what we did already in the early 20th century. We are evaluating drugs of the 21st century, gene therapy, using tests that are that simple and that old. So what can we do to move next step in the 21st century and having devices and outcomes that are much more representative of patients' real life? And we have the technology, that's the wearable technologies, the magnetoinertial technologies that allows to quantify any single movement of patients in the real life over a long period of time, like 1 month, 2 months in the real life. And then from the billions of points that you gather to come back to a single point, a single outcome that is clinically relevant and that is robust. And doing that in Duchenne muscular dystrophy, for instance, we could demonstrate that we can make trials much shorter with much less patients because we are much more precise. This outcome has been qualified by the European Medical Association. Now it's at the FDA level. We are doing similar work in spinal muscular atrophy, in Angelman syndrome, in several other diseases, because we truly believe that with new technologies and wearable device, you have the power to very precisely measure any single movement. And then if you are able to extract out of this an outcome that is significant according to patient's condition and according to the disease, then you are much more powerful than if you take a picture of the patients at time t. So that's what my research is about in outcome measures.
Sure, and that's interesting that you bring up the sensors and the wearable devices. We've seen decentralized trials as a trend that's happening across the industry, especially during the pandemic, where remote monitoring has been so important. But I guess from the patient perspective, I think the benefits from clinical development are pretty clear, but maybe Mencia, do you have any comments on how these wearable technologies and looking at new endpoints or new outcome measures impacts the patient experience during the clinical trials and beyond?
Yeah. Well, I think that Laurent has expressed beautifully the advantages of this type of technology being incorporated to an assessment of patients. But I'd like to highlight the patient experience when taking part in an assessment, especially during a clinical trial. It is very frequent that patients and caregivers envisage this assessment with some kind of anxiety because they normally want to show their optimal performance, because they are probably the ones that have the highest interest on finding out whether a therapy is effective or not to treat their condition. On the other hand, we have that it is not infrequent that patients are followed at reference centers, and they have frequently to travel for several hours to get to this place to do the assessment. Also, obviously, assessments have to take place during the established appointment, and the validated existing outcome measures for SMA, as Laurent was saying, can only capture performance at a specific moment in time. So on the contrary, wearables and sensors can move away from these biases that can be influenced in the patient's performance, such as, for instance, fatigue as a consequence of traveling, or performing at an artificial environment, just performing on your everyday life. And they can be used at home. So they can really reduce significantly the burden of participating on the trial. Another significant advantage of these devices, and it's already been mentioned by Laurent, is that if there is an adequate involvement of healthcare practitioners and patients in the design of these devices, you can really target what's relevant to patients about their condition, and you can look at how a treatment can be impacting on those very items, which is what would be meaningful of a treatment for a patient. So, so there are very clear advantages to all of this.
Okay, great. So switching gears a little bit, I'd love to talk about collaboration between patients and other stakeholders. So Kristen, you mentioned that at Faster Cures, you're looking into the bottlenecks that happen in the drug development process. And so I'm wondering, for rare diseases like SMA, where are those bottlenecks, and how can patient organizations work with other stakeholders to help address them?
Well, they are many. And there are many ways that patient organizations can work with other stakeholders to address them. But I would like to echo and support what Laurent and Mencia just said about engaging patients in better understanding their lived experience with their condition and their experience with their treatments and what's important to them in terms of quality of life and outcomes is not something that has traditionally been the focus, I think, of biomedical research and development necessarily. I think most people involved in it would certainly believe and want to help patients improve their quality of life, but I think the way that the system has grown up and incentives have kind of come into place, and habits. As Laurent said, we're using outcome measures that were designed by doctors 100 years ago. These things have all kind of created a system where patients' needs are not necessarily, and experience are not necessarily front and center. And then I think what we've seen over the last certainly 10 or 15 years is just an increasing level of engagement and sophistication by patient organizations as participants in the process, and a greater willingness by the other stakeholders and interest by the other stakeholders in giving them a seat at the table and having them have a seat at the table. Certainly not universally true, but it's a growing. I think in the U.S. a very good example of that is at the Food and Drug Administration, our regulatory agency, where several years ago they made it a priority. They have a program now, patient-focused drug development, which is intended to provide some structure to their efforts to engage with patient communities in particular conditions, to both hear their stories from, anecdotally, but also to listen to data that these patient organizations are bringing to the table about their communities, about the subtypes of patients in their communities and how they differ. Again, all their experiences with treatment and with their condition. The FDA now has a very structured process to be able to take in all that information and to consider it when making their product evaluation decisions. That hasn't been true for most of the years of the FDA's existence. As I said, it's just been, over the last 10 to 15 years, a much more engagement and collaboration, I think initiated by the patient organizations, but that other stakeholders are much more receptive to engaging with these communities to be able to do what they do better.
Great, and a lot to unpack in your response, but one thing you mentioned is the collaboration with regulators. And so I guess, Laurent, to you, I'd love to hear your thoughts on to what extent regulators should be looking at these new outcome measures that are very focused on the patient responses as approvable endpoints. And you mentioned that there's some work ongoing to accept the wearable devices and those types of things at FDA and EMA. And I'm wondering, how far have we gotten in making that a reality?
When you discuss with regulators, they just want to understand, they just want to learn, and they just want to have better outcomes and better medication. And and they want you to be transparent and honest and to do things properly. And when you have understood that, that makes things much easier. And for instance, our experience with EMA for the qualification of this kind of outcome in Duchenne was extremely positive. It was long. It was like 3 years of interactions. And now when we discuss with the regulators about this process, they say, we have learned a lot, and we actually also learned a lot. And now we are at the FDA level with the same kind of outcomes, and we are learning a lot from the regulators and vice versa. So I think that if we consider regulators as person who have their own mindset and their own way of looking at your data, and that you just have to figure out what is this mindset, but they are absolutely open to consider new way of seeing things, a new way of measuring things, you can be very successful. So please come with something more clever, but do it seriously with properly conducted studies, with properly conducted statistical analysis. And it really improves actually the benchmark that we have as academic person. So if we want to do something else than just publishing a paper in a nice journal, and we want to be influential at the regulators and policymaker level, we need to upgrade our level of way of conducting our experience and analyzing our data. But my personal experience is that regulators are not closed persons. They are really open-minded, but you just need to convince them. And they are ready to be convinced, but you have to explain, and then to explain again.
Sure, okay. Okay, and so I guess Kristen and Mencia, we've talked about the importance of collaboration with the patient organizations and other stakeholders, and I'm wondering, with a rare disease like SMA, how important is cross-border collaboration, you know, engaging patient groups from different international regions?
Well, that's our everyday work in SMA Europe. We put the effort to get our different organizations representing the national communities with SMA to have the same focus and to try to prioritize in a similar way. And it obviously makes you much more impactful when you have a broad consensus across the countries, and not only about the patient community, but also across healthcare practitioners on specific issues that are important for us. The impact that you can produce then on every country, each match is much bigger. Now, when you're working in Europe, where we each of us have our system and our language and our different national issues, that can become very challenging, but it's worth every minute of your effort, because you can see, like, from cooperating, from learning from each other, but also by showing to your national authorities, for instance, what's being done on other countries and how we could pick up best practices. It just contributes for the best. So, I mean, also we can't forget that SMA is a rare disease. Our community is not that broad. So, so if you want to take the best from the best, and I mean from research, you want to promote the best research, you want to promote and develop the best standards of care, the best practices, etc. You really need to have a global approach.
Yeah, I certainly agree. I think particularly in rare disease, obviously, you know, there are a few patients and they are globally distributed. So being able to have a handle on where all of your patients are and a relationship with them in some way, a connection to them, is incredibly valuable, not just to the patient organization, but to the other stakeholders as well. I mean, sometimes merely having a contact registry of patients across the world is something enormously valuable to a company. I think it's also for patient organizations that fund research, they want to fund, I think Mencia alluded to this, want to fund research wherever it's taking place. They want to fund the best researchers in their particular disease area, or attract the best researchers in their condition. And it can be challenging, I think, when you're a very small organization, often run purely by volunteers. But I think that's a priority.
And so, Laurent, I'd like to go to something that you mentioned as one of your main focuses at the beginning. We haven't really talked about diagnosis and screening patients. So can you tell me where we are in this effort to make newborn screening the norm, so that we're doing less of treating symptomatic patients and more intervening before the symptoms start?
Well, the first thing is to know is that for people who are not, familiar with all results that came out the SMA field, newborn screening and early diagnostic is just transforming the field. I mean, a patient who is treated after the symptom can improve, can be much better. A patient who is treated at birth, today we still have about, according to the treatment, according to when you treated the patients, but between 70 and 80% of patients who are symptom-free. And so it's patients who many of them would be dead today. All of them, none of them would be ambulant, and they are running in the community. I used to compare the magnitude of effect like jumping out of a flight with a parachute or without a parachute. It's, you don't need 20 patients, you don't need 100 of patients. You have patients would be dead and they are just running in the community. So it's completely transformative. And it's obvious, we're just talking about motor neurons, which are cells that do not multiplicate, that do not regenerate, that die. And when these cells do not exist anymore, you can do whatever you want. You can save the last ones, but you will not resuscitate or make happen new cells out of the blue. If you want to be efficient, you have to keep the cells alive and treat as soon as possible. That's so obvious. And there are now plenty of evidences from the animal models and plenty of evidences from the human trials. And we have recently reviewed all the evidence from across all the trials, and there are like 13 or 14 different pieces of evidence that the earliest you treat, the better it is. And which is surprising is that in Europe, there are not so many countries and regions where we screen today. The screening is in 2 regions of Germany, Bavaria and North Westphalia, 2 regions of Italy, Tuscany in Lazio, 1 region of Belgium, southern Belgium, and that's it. So 31 states of the United States, which is pretty good, but philosophy of screening, of newborn screening in the US and in Europe is very different. A region of Australia, a very teeny part of Moscow in Russia, Israel and Qatar, and to my best knowledge, that's it. Which means that, and Canada has started also. So it means that it's not the majority of the population in the countries where the drugs are approved today. The question afterwards is why? Why don't we? Why is newborn screening now the rules everywhere? And there are, actually some pieces of answer. One of the answers is that it's a genetic screening, and it's disruptive with the traditional metabolic screening. So for 40 years now, we perform newborn screening in Europe and in the US. And for more than 40 years now, it's a metabolic screening. And then we shift the technology and we go to genetic newborn screening.
Okay, sure. And so we've talked about some of the different collaborations that need to go on with patients, but one of the relationships we haven't really discussed is that with the biopharma companies. And so now that we have 3 approved drugs and more patients being treated, that doesn't mean that all the problems are being solved. So Mencia, I'm wondering how the patient communities can communicate the need for continued innovation to biopharma companies.
Mm-hmm. Well, we have some very successful experiences of establishing partnerships with pharma companies that are investing on SMA. And I mean successful for both sides. I have seen myself how we can positively influence their strategy or the way that they are orienting their studies in a way that's beneficial for both parties. For us patients, it's important that the companies that enter into the SMA world, they have a disease approach rather than an approach based on a single drug development. Even treated population, and even some of the treated population very early after birth, some develop symptoms, and therefore there are still some unmet needs that have to be addressed. So as SMA is not yet cured, it is important that we somehow educate pharma on having this disease approach and tackling the disease from different angles, and which is what we really need and which would make treatments really successful for us.
Sure. And Laurent, you mentioned at the beginning that the ability to have a pregnancy, things like that are important to patients. And I'm wondering if you can go into a little bit more about the different aspects of care that still need to be addressed by future innovations for patients.
Well, indeed, if you take the time to discuss with your teenagers and ask candidly the question, are you going to have children? Are you going to get married? I can tell you that most of my teenagers' patients dream about wedding with the right dress on the wheelchair and meeting the right one and having children. And yes, that's actually what they dream about. And the beauty in the 21st century is that when you have such a question, you don't ask to your doctor. Most of the time you ask Siri or you go on Google. And there is actually a lot of exchange on the forum and the blogs between patients. The good point at the end of the day is that they finally go to my consultation. There are plenty of questions. The first one is, I'm on treatment. I'm on neural therapy, intrathecal therapy. Can I be pregnant? What is the risk for my baby? The answer today is very simple. We don't know, and the best advice we can give is to stop. So next question is, what's the price I'm going to pay in terms of loss of function? If I lose the function that I've saved over the last 2 years with this specific disease-modifying treatment, is it something that I'm going to catch up later if I go back on treatment after my pregnancy? I don't know. So what I'm going to lose in terms of function during my pregnancy? Am I going to be able to deliver have a vaginal delivery, or do I need a Kaiser section? So I think that we have to gather many more information about the drugs that we are using today. Are we able to stop this medication for 2 years, 3 years? Of course, to gather all information that we can about pregnancy on disease-modifying therapy, to try to gather information from animal models, of course, and then to work on the awareness of non-SMA doctors who are working with these patients. But this is true for pregnancy, but it's actually true for many other specialization. I think about dentistry, for instance, to provide dental care for a patient with a severe SMA type 1 and who was grown up and was like 11 years is very challenging. To provide cares that are absolutely not related to SMA, but who are normal at the age of 30, 40, 50 years. If you don't know the disease, for the doctors, it can be very challenging. So one of the future line of thinking is probably to develop awareness and education of doctors outside the SMA field. And there are several ways. The first one is to try to bring the information together and to bring the knowledge together. The other one is to have a very high-level SMA clinic where gynecologists have seen many patients with SMA and they can deliver the right message. And that's, for instance, what happens in some country. In Paris, for instance, in the hospital I was working in, we had a team who had seen a lot of ladies with plenty of different neuromuscular diseases, and the gynecologist was very aware and ready to help these ladies in the pregnancy. But if the lady lives 800 or 1,000 miles away, I mean, the day she will deliver, she will not be on site, right? So working just on this kind of organization will probably help a certain number of patients, but certainly not all of them. So I think that it's important to develop the knowledge, to develop the know-how, and then to be able to export this knowledge and know-how at the local level. And which is true for SMA is going to be true for many other rare diseases. If we start treating rare diseases more efficiently, we'll have many more adults, will engage in many more affective life, and these questions of parenthood in people with rare disease will only grow up with time. So we really have to develop our skills on how to help during this pregnancy, and then being able to disseminate this now our experience in centers outside very top level centers.
Great. So I think we are just about out of time, but I'd like to leave the panel with one final question. So Laurent, you mentioned one of the areas where we need to focus our innovation now, and I'm wondering if there are other areas that are a high priority for patients as we're looking to the future of SMA treatment.
Well, I think that for me, another priority is access to care for everybody, because, you know, 5 years ago, we had no cure or no treatment, as Mensha mentioned, and you just had standard of care, which is not that bad to have standard of care. But nowadays, in some countries, you don't have standard of care and you don't have disease-modifying treatment. And I think that as a community, the beauty of all this disease-modifying treatment, it has been transformative in our management and care of SMA and for our patients. And I think that we as a community of doctors, of patients, advocacy group, and of pharma companies should do our best to give the broadest access possible to these new medications across the world.
If I can build on to what Laurent was expressing, I would say that there are two important challenges that we're facing. One is to adapt care to the new situation that's coming with these treatments that are changing the natural course of the disease, and therefore traditional approaches that have been approved by the scientific community for the past 20 years, maybe they are no longer applicable, and they have to start thinking out of the box and think how they have to approach problems that come into the patient life that could not be addressed, but maybe now if they are addressed differently, the prognosis would be better. So that's the first challenge to doctors with evolving the standards of care. And secondly, we have to be careful on not creating like a division in our community.
Well, I'll just chime in to say that I think the examples that you've heard here are great examples of why it's so critical for patient organizations and patients to be engaged as key stakeholders in this whole process, because the work is never done, unfortunately. Even when, as an SMA, we've had a wonderful series of new treatments coming out of research and development. I think what we've all come to understand is that that's not ever likely to be enough. There are always populations that aren't being helped by these treatments. There are other outcomes that are important to patients that need to be addressed. There are issues around access and treatment that patient advocates are now having to engage with. Prevention has become, whether newborn screening or via other means, has become a preoccupation, I think, for many patient organizations in the absence of new treatments. So, the work is never done, and having patients kind of at the table and challenging the other actors in the system to think creatively, to think out of the box, as Mencia said, is really a positive development, and one I hope we're going to see a lot more of.
Thank you all for these great responses. I think we've outlined very well exactly where the patients can fit into this process and some of the progress that's been made and where we have to go from here. So that's everything today. Thank you all.
Thank you, Lauren, Christine, Mencia, and Laurent for enlightening discussion. As you all have highlighted, new treatments and care must center around what patients need most, and the collaborations require an effective framework beyond just science. We are all in this together for a future where patients don't have to make difficult choices, like between the ability to paint and the ability to walk. Now let's discuss the medicines in the making and how best to translate fundamentals into meaningful therapies. Hosting this session is Rich Saul, Head of WuXi AppTec Boston office and Senior Advisor of Strategic Initiatives.
Okay, thanks everybody for coming today. It's it's a pleasure for me to welcome you to the segment of today, third segment of what will be today's webinar on collaborations that transform, the WuXi AppTec series, collaborations that transform. And today we're going to talk about the rare disease spinal muscular atrophy, or SMA, a group of autosomal recessively inherited progressive degeneration neuromuscular disorders, which in its most severe form is the leading cause of genetic death in the world, and accounts for somewhere between 1 in 6,000 to 1 in 10,000 live births around the world. It affects about 100,000 people, 120,000 people globally, and we have an impact of about 20,000 new cases a year. Until recently, it was thought that this was the SMA basically was a non-curable disease. Now, we have a very strong panel with us today. And before we get to that point and introducing them, I'd just like to point out that over the last several years, we've seen remarkable advances in SMA-specific therapies. And so with me today are key individuals in this regard, the drug hunters and clinicians who seek solutions for SMA patients. And presently there were 2 approved therapies until today. There's now 3. One is the antisense drug Esperanza, the gene therapy Zolgensma, which is approved in 2019 for SM1 replacement, SM1 gene replacement therapy. And today we heard that the small molecule drug Risdiplam has been approved. So joining me today for the discussion on SMA is Tom Crawford, professor of neurology at Johns Hopkins University, Hank Meyer, professor of clinical pediatrics at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, Stuart Peltz, presumably we think he's at a press conference. He's the CEO, he was the CEO of PTC Therapeutics, and hopefully we'll get to him at some point. Stan Crook, chairman of the board he's the CEO of Ionis Pharmaceuticals. Karen Chen, who's the CEO of the SMA Foundation. Please join me in welcoming them. So over the next 45 to 50 minutes, we will discuss some of these recent developments in SMA, and we've allowed audience to submit questions. And the topics we'd like to cover then are some of the key issues. There are going to be 5 key issues, basically, we'd like to discuss. The key issues or opportunities in SMA. We'd like to discuss, do the approved drugs fall short of addressing issues? We'd like to discuss improvements that we're working on in the field. And then we'd like to tackle technologies and then move into the new directions of SMA in the future. Okay, so the first one, I'd like to thank everybody for joining us. I'm going to direct this to Karen first. Karen, can you discuss for us, let's say, with respect to prevention and diagnosis and treatment, from your viewpoint of the SMA organization as a patient advocate organization, and basically what patients think?
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you again for having me. I think that the SMA field has been quite fortunate in the last few years to have now 3 approved therapies with different platforms and modalities. But I think that there still remains a lot to be done, and I think we'll address some further treatments shortly. So I think I would like to really talk about what we can do in the arenas of prevention/diagnosis. Obviously, SMA is a genetic disease, so there is a genetic test for it. And a newborn screening has rolled out in many states in the US, but I think there still remains an opportunity to do more in the way of newborn screening within the US, but certainly outside the US also. Because since, as you mentioned, it is a disease that affects children, there's a very steep decline in function, probably due to the underlying loss of motor neurons in SMA children very early on. And we're talking in the first month, if not the first weeks. So the time between diagnosis to treatment is very crucial and very important. And so during this time, not only are parents and families grappling with the diagnosis for their child, but they have to quickly decide whether to treat and this is of course fortunate, which treatment to choose. So I think we can still do a lot as far as informing clinicians and genetic counselors as to what's available and to ease that transition for patients and families.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Let's move to our physicians. Let's start with Tom.
So one thing I do want to emphasize is that SMA has, we started out with the most hopeless disease, and along the way, everything worked. Everything fell into place in a way that was unpredictable in anticipation of it, but in retrospect, we realized how lucky we were. And I think I'll have the opportunity to go through some of those things that worked well, because they'll be relevant to all the other diseases that come on, because some of them don't have those advantages, some of them do. And recognizing where the problems are with each, I think SMA is going to be the example of how everything falls in the right way, and so there's special challenges that might come along the way if you don't have each of those elements. What's remaining for SMA is that we have a large group of people who didn't benefit from treatment before they lost their motor neurons. And so they have varying degrees of weakness, from ability to sit to ability to move hardly at all. And other therapies that we can perhaps evolve and develop that will maximize what they've got would be very much needed. And I also see a need to expand the range. How can we not just target the very first step of pathogenesis, SMN deficiency, but the downstream complications that happen to motor neurons as a consequence of having been damaged along the way? Are there ways that we can use to expand their efforts? All of those are going to be with a smaller effect size. So we're going to need to have biomarkers and other kinds of ways to be able to evaluate these more subtle therapies as they come along.
Terrific, thank you. Hank, we get your perspective. Yeah.
I'm a pulmonary clinician, and so I work with neurologists in managing the pulmonary manifestations of SMA. And those largely haven't changed, other than the fact that a lot of the symptoms that we see happen either later or in a slightly different disease population. And so what's happening is really two things. The disease-modifying therapies, which have had a dramatic impact on survival and morbidity, still at this point haven't relieved all the symptoms. And so there's still plenty of pulmonary management to do, but there also is certainly going to be an increased survival of the patients that otherwise would have had severe enough disease to not live out of infancy or to have substantial challenges there. And that will require, I think, more people with an interest in managing the clinical manifestations, while further work is done on how to take things even a step further, as Tom mentioned, and hopefully getting to the point of regaining lost function, or further solidifying preservation of function.
Thanks. Sans, because of individuals like yourself who've had a particular vision of implementing therapies, we're so happy that you can join us today. Maybe you could provide us with some of your perspectives as well.
Oh, thanks, and thanks for having me. From my perspective, Spinraza and the entire SMA therapy landscape reflects advances due to very long-term investments in three technologies. And that, I think, is, to me, in some ways, the most remarkable feature of what's happened. To begin with, SMA has been misdiagnosed for centuries, or not diagnosed. And that all changed when the cause of the disease was understood as a loss of function, homozygous loss of function of SMN1 gene. And then that was rapidly followed by the discovery of a redundant gene, SMN2, that would make the protein but for a mutation in a splice or enhancer sequence. So that is a technology that's applicable genome-wide. And we see that happening in disease after disease. The second area of technology that I think was critical is all the investment in understanding RNA biology and biochemistry. Without that, none of this would be possible. And Nobel Prizes in splicing have been granted, and those were instrumental in addressing the problem because it was a splicing defect. And then the third is antisense technology, which I've led and at Ionis. And that's 30 years of effort to create the technology that allowed us to take advantage of this. And so it is, I think, a truly remarkable story of technology. And if you look at the gene therapy, that's another technology that's had 40 plus years, multiple billions of dollars of investment to deliver value to these patients today. So I think of this as truly a miracle of modern technology. And what's remarkable to me is it's portable. These kinds of solutions are being repeated in a wide range of diseases and right at Ionis. So it's a very exciting time for all of us. And it's a privilege to be associated with treatment for patients with SMA.
That's terrific. Thanks very much, Stan. But we all know that drugs aren't perfect, right? They don't represent a total solution necessarily. They're, everything has a benefit and there's a risk. Maybe I could start with Karen around, the way the patients and the advocacy groups might view where do these drugs maybe fall short of addressing some of those issues. And then we'll come back to folks and we'll ask about what we're doing about it. Okay? Karen?
Sure. I think that we're so fortunate in the SMA community to actually have 3 approved drugs with different modalities. So we have Spinraza, which came first when it was transformative. We have gene therapy, which is one and done. And now we actually have a small molecule, which is systemically available. And so I think we have very good coverage with different modalities with pros and cons of each for SMN replacement and upregulation. And so as was stated earlier, we need to now focus on non-SMN therapies, SMN-independent therapies. So for old patients especially, who have lost motor neurons early on in disease, they're not going to be regained, or that's the dogma. So we actually, as second-generation drugs, have focused on muscle, so muscle-specific therapies such as myostatin inhibitors. And we see those in clinical trials now. But looking into the future, the SMA Foundation in the last year or so has focused on regenerative medicine and cell replacement therapies, whether they be stem cell technologies or regenerative sprouting drugs targeting the neuromuscular junction. So I think that there's a whole new world, and the advantage in SMA is rather than having the ongoing degenerative disease process with SMN replacement therapies, we've actually stabilized patients. And we see that even with older patients, but these patients aren't regaining function. And so the next set of therapies hopefully will target increases in function through SMN independent means.
Okay, thank you. Now let me address to Tom for a second. I mean, what would be, as a physician, what kind of ideal drug would you like to have for SMA?
Well, I'd love to be able to get all my kids that are, in wheelchairs jump up and start dancing. I am mindful of the fact that we had these 3 drugs that had an effect size that was so extraordinary that they could be demonstrated on relatively small numbers of patients. And that was key because the drugs are, very, very expensive. So we can't do trials of thousands of patients. So in addition to add on to what Karen Chen says, we need to have means to be able to evaluate smaller effect sizes. And that's going to have to be a biomarker or other sort of way to enhance the measurement of outcomes. Now, we have kids who are so profoundly weak, or adults that are so profoundly weak they can move hardly at all, or they're just their eyes or their fingers a tiny little bit. These folks are, for the large part, very, very, very functional, able to do amazing things with almost nothing. And so being able to maintain that little bit is really important, but also how to measure a tiny little bit improvement of maybe just finger function versus being able to lean over and pick up something from the floor. The outcome measures are so disparate that it's hard to evaluate an improvement. And so as a group, even though it's a monogenic disease with a single dimension of expression weakness, measurement turns out to be one of the key barriers to being able to take on any of these new ideas that I hope I and smarter people than I come along with, because it's going to be some grand new ideas like a new antisense technology or something, Stan.
Yeah, so it goes right to Stan now. So let me ask, Stan, we're working on second generation technologies for SMA, and what are we doing, and what are we trying to combine in that, or trying to address?
Well, we do think we can do better. But before I answer that question directly, I do want to discuss what I'm paying especially close attention to. We have a growing number of SMA patients who were treated prior to symptoms. And so far, we've seen really remarkable benefit there. Most of these children seem to be developing with normal motor milestones. So I think one of the most important things we do need to watch now with all three modes is the clinical course over the long haul. And we've been following some of these patients now 8 years. And remarkably to me, having been involved in drug discovery leadership positions for now a lifetime, we have not seen the emergence of side effects chronically, and we have not seen a great deal of loss of efficacy yet. And I think the same questions pertain to the gene therapy very much, and they also pertain to the small molecules. So I think we need to keep learning from the drugs that we have. And I think that's really critical. For example, I've been assuming somewhere along the way we might see a systemic manifestation of this mutation. And today, at least with the patients that we're following, we haven't seen that. With regard to second generation, obviously Spinraza is administered intrathecally. So one of the most important things for us to do, especially for the adults, is to reduce the frequency of those injections. And so one of our focal points was to extend the duration of effect. We've been very cautious in the dose frequency. We didn't want to lose benefit in these patients, but we're hopeful that we can move to once a year administration. I think that would be a big help. And then we think also that we have identified a more potent molecule. And so the duration of effect is, of course, a function of where you are in the dose response curve versus, and in addition, the elimination half-life for the tissues. So a little more potency and getting to these babies as they're born.
Thank you, Stan. So that leads to the areas of discussion around improvements. Where can we improve? Is it discovery process? It's the clinical aspects? Is it collaborations? Going to be more collaborations needed? We're talking about education. Are we talking about the regulatory aspects? Maybe we can start a discussion first with Hank.
Yeah, I'd just like, if I could, to partner with what Stan was saying. And one of the things that I think is critical in sort of taking the controlled phase 3 study results and expecting to see something similar in reality is ensuring that the care that patients are getting out in the community is consistent. And that's certainly assured in a phase 3 study at a number of small sites. And as access is improving, we need to make sure that the clinical care, both chronically and acutely, is the same. And to the extent that it isn't, then we're not going to necessarily realize the same results that we're seeing in a more controlled situation. And so it'd be another way of, for me to advocate for improving both the education and the quality of clinical care more broadly than at major medical institutions.
Well, thank you. So in the areas of improvement, let's talk about maybe education and awareness. This is an important month for SMA, and maybe Karen can comment for us what kind of activities are you seeing on the R&D relationship to R&D front or your own different kind of stakeholders in your community with respect to awareness and things of that nature for SMA?
Sure. I mean, August, I guess you were just saying, is SMA Awareness Month. But for all of us in the community, I think, every month is SMA Awareness Month. So we don't actually specifically have any activities planned for this month. And now that we're under pandemic lockdown in a lot of places, I think a lot of the activities have switched to a more virtual, arena. But I think there still needs to be, the message still needs to go out that there's still more that can be done. We're finding that obviously with each approval, it's transformative and it's great, but then there's a sense, even with regulatory agencies, that, well, we've cured the disease, quote unquote. And so we should move on to other diseases. We find that certainly for the majority of SMA patients, even though they've seen stability in the course of their disease, which is a great win, there still isn't a frank improvement. So there's still a lot to be done. And I think getting that message out is important. We've actually had feedback from the FDA saying, well, it isn't enough, and we've approved all these great drugs. So I think that still remains a message that should be shared across all our stakeholders. We've been fortunate in SMA to have had great collaborations amongst clinicians and academics like Tom and Hank, and with companies. I've worked closely with Stan and Stu and Paolo at Roche. So I think we need to continue doing that, since in the future, I think we're going to see potential combinations of therapies. And so I think it's important to actually have this ability to work together because combinations will ultimately help patients. And I think that's what we're all trying to do.
Well, thank you. So I want to go, oh, yes, please.
Can I jump in under, because I have something that adds to every comment before. SMA is an interesting disorder in that it appears to worsen across the full range of life, from prenatal periods to elderly folks who will continue to decline. So it's unusual in that it has a capacity to worsen at all ages. However, worsening looks weird when you're normally developing. And so a kid who may in fact have some slippage in the number of motor neurons that occurs during a time of normal development actually won't show that stuff necessarily until they're at a point of stasis. And so we need to know something about the basic biology. And one of the things that Karen just said is just like fingernails on a blackboard for me. We have not solved this problem. We have been able to substitute the abundance of protein by one of three different means at a time when it's important. So it's a very early stage, but we don't know why SMA targets motor neurons or how motor neurons decline. And that kind of basic knowledge is not been solved and is critical to not just SMA, but we could leverage that information for a range of other diseases as well. So the combination of development, which obscures degeneration, plus inability to know what's really going on at the level of motor neurons is two major impediments to development of this therapy and moving forward.
Thank you. Stan, has the gene therapy or antisense technology been what I'll call optimized? And it could be from optimized with respect to manufacturing, optimized with respect to how we treat the patients. Kind of wide-ranging question, but this concept of optimization, I think we talked about delivery a few minutes ago, but other aspects that we must consider.
Let me answer that in just a second, Rich. I want to just come back to the business of combinations and what's next. I don't think, at least speaking for myself, I don't know exactly where the holes are. What is left to do exactly? I think we really need to invest in more clinical understanding of what's happening longer term to these patients to understand what we want to try to fix. Knowing what you're fixing is the first step in fixing. And I, for one, certainly we know that the older patients still need lots of help, and the patients that we weren't able to get to early need lots of help. So I think figuring out why we're combining drugs is a really important step before we talk about combinations. And the second, and I very much agree with what Tom had to say. I think the biology of this disease and the biochemistry of this disease, especially beyond the neuron, is poorly understood, and work needs to continue there. And what I would also add is that the SMA Foundation made a really important difference. And it is, I think, the foundation that I suggest to people that they look at when they think about building a charitable foundation to enable treatment for disease. Having an active, effective patient advocacy group is important and remarkably strong in SMA. And the beauty of antisense is it is portable. And so we we have these problems across the board, and we now have solutions. With regard to the future of SMA, it is really critical that a regulatory dialogue that's productive take place. With Spinraza, I knew we had a remarkable drug with the fifth baby. It was certain. And, that never happens. That just never happens. I think one of the things that the SMA Foundation should consider is playing an even more effective role in mediating regulatory interactions and finding solutions to what it is we measure, how we measure it, and what are the criteria for approval in the coming years. That's going to be the big issue.
Right. So, I understand that the SMA Foundation has played an important role in the case of the development of the small molecule from PTC. So, maybe you can talk a little bit about that. I understand that you're basically an equal player with other organizations at the table.
Yes, so I think that like I said, we've been fortunate to work with all the pharma and biotech companies, and they've been quite open in working with us. I think that patient organizations are helpful not only as advocates, but in general. I get other disease foundations asking me all the time, what can they do? And I think it's important to really, come up with tools that are useful for all drug developers, whether they be natural history studies, biomarkers, clinical outcomes, et cetera. So yes, I think Roche and PTC do actually view us as an equal partner. It's been, enlightening for them to actually get the patient perspective of what patients need. So instead of relying just on patient-reported outcomes and clinical outcomes at the end of your trial, you actually want to design your trial and even come up with therapeutic targets based on what patients need. And I think that's even more important now. As we've discussed in a number of questions previously, there still remains a need in the older patients. And as Tom said, we're going to need better biomarkers and clinical outcomes because these are going to be small changes. And so this is something that the foundation and other foundations can help drug developers, regulators, and clinicians do.
Well, thank you. Thank you. So one of the issues that we've encountered now in modern days is the COVID-19 problem. And so I'm going to ask the physicians. We'll come back to Karen in a moment too. How has COVID-19 affected your ability to deliver care to the patients? Let's start with Hank in this one.
For no particularly good reason, it really hasn't. I'm speaking as a pulmonologist. Mm-hmm. I'll defer administration of therapeutics to Tom because that's more in line with what he does. Mm-hmm. And at my hospital, which is a fairly large hospital with a large neuromuscular population, we actually haven't had any SMA or any patient with progressive neuromuscular disease admitted with COVID. And I was talking with a parent about that, and the only explanation I can come up with is that we are now, as a community, living the way parents of children with neuromuscular disease live through the winter. when influenza and rhinovirus and RSV, all the bad respiratory viruses are quite prominent. But that's with the addition of some people, depending on where you live, actually helping out by wearing face masks. And so I think the social distancing, the extreme caution and interacting in communities has actually made it pretty, I wouldn't say certain, but highly unlikely that at least the patients in my catchment area have been exposed to it. And I haven't heard from any other colleagues of a significant number of SMA patients ending up in the hospital. Having said that, if they were to be exposed to coronavirus, they would likely have the same impact as being exposed to any of the other respiratory viruses. And that's not at all to minimize it, but if the families and the caregivers are trained in recognizing early changes in symptoms and then following an acute management plan with airway clearance and additional respiratory support, it's certainly an infection or a condition that is survivable.
Thanks. Tom, would you like to add into that?
Just real briefly, because this has been such a spectacular success, it's obviously gotten a lot of publicity and there's a lot of buzz about it. And as a consequence, there's a little bit of a celebrity status for these kids and adults. So I've actually not had any difficulty getting them through. Of course, it takes twice as long to do half as much because of all the requirements and things that get in the way. But I've not had any difficulty getting Spinraza and Zolgensma to everybody who deserves to have it on time.
Okay, Karen, let's take a look at it from a patient view. Has it been an issue trying to access that, getting to the hospital, or the doctor getting diagnosed in the proper way, and then accessing the medicines?
I think one aspect that that could be impacted is the genetic diagnosis. I think that because that's not as acute in a way, and these are families who may not be familiar with SMA. They have a child, they don't know what's wrong. I can see that might be impacted. I don't know of any cases. I know that in some of the trials that are ongoing, that for pre-symptomatic infants, that they are actually having more trouble now compared to prior to COVID in getting pre-symptomatic infants. So I'm assuming that the genetic diagnosis might be impacted.
Well, thank you. I'd like to ask,
just a
oh yes, sure.
The place that COVID, I think SMA is privileged. We're seeing effects of the quarantine to healthy approach across the board in all of the diseases that we're involved in. And one of the most profound effects, and it will be important in the coming years, is meaningful delays in enrollment in a variety of studies. And that's happening across the industry. And delays in enrollment cost time, they cost money, but they can also really cause issues with the quality of the clinical trial. Mm-hmm. So I'm pleased to hear that SMA patients haven't had difficulty, but I think that's a very privileged position for these patients to be in.
Agreed.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I'd like to ask our panelists, what are your top three concerns regarding, or concerns, what are your top three considerations, I should say, with respect to the technologies and modalities that we should be considering, going forward? Is it combinations? We touched a little bit on this. Is it delivery? Is it modalities? New targets? Maybe we can dwell a little bit more on these things. R&D improvements. I'll start with, in fact, why don't we start with Stan on this one?
Well, I think we've dealt with that to a large extent, Rich. I think we need to understand why we would be combining these drugs, what our goals are. We need to adjust the regulatory requirements and have biomarkers so that we can actually measure an effect and get the job done. And to me, it's the biology of the disease in the muscle, if there is one, if there is biology that's being practiced in the muscle. Because if there is, then that's something that that we may be able to fix directly. And if it's simply secondary to atrophy, that's a very different kind of problem.
Sure.
So I think the panel has focused very well on all of the sort of key issues right now that remain in this disease. I'll just add that SMA patients now are among the privileged few. And I'm thinking primarily of all the diseases that we're trying to fix that don't have Spinraza, gene therapy, small molecules. And we're excited to be involved in every one of those areas, and we're fixing them.
Well, thanks. Thank you. Tom, I'll go to you next. You're engaged in R&D, looking at maybe new targets, et cetera, in addition to your clinical work. What's important? What are your top considerations that you're looking at now?
Well, so I just think about each of the modalities has something that I don't know about yet. In the case of Spinraza, it's distribution. Are we getting it to all the motor neurons that could benefit from it? Are we changing the phenotype from a bottom to top to bottom kind of distribution of where we're treatment? In the case of risdiplam, I don't know how I would be able to detect waning of efficacy during a time of development, because kids are going to get better because they're getting stronger, and we may not be able to see it until much later on. So that's an issue. With new small molecules, it's a small cohort. We're going to be wanting to learn about safety in a much larger group of patients before we jump in altogether. But these are manageable, and these are questions you can create experiments about and try to delve into. The harder thing for not just SMA but for all the other diseases is how do you measure the benefit? SMA is advantage because it's a single dimension of expression, weakness of muscles. How many of those monogenic diseases you're thinking about, Stan, express in one way and one way only, as opposed to 2 or 3 different ways that they come across? Or things that are hard to measure, like coordination or intelligence. Those are things that are meaningful and hugely meaningful to the life of the patient, and yet they don't array out in a way that we could potentially develop the next series of molecules. For me, that's going to be the big challenge for clinical medicine, is measurement. And it's such a prosaic and boring topic, and yet it's what things fall apart. Remember AIDS. The first patients were approved on death, and very quickly ACT UP said, no, wait, we need to have a biomarker, and they were able to approve CD4 counts so that the next generation was able to be tested on a biomarker and approved on a biomarker. That's the kind of movement we have to develop in both SMA and across the rare disease space.
Hank, would you like to add into that?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I have found troubling in SMA1 trials is the outcome of 16 hours of mechanical ventilation and or death as the primary pulmonary outcome. I say that, I criticize that, but unfortunately we're really lacking in suitable outcomes to replace that. What we're really, the endpoint immediately before mortality is respiratory failure. And there are a variety of different ways to assess that, and that all requires pretty involved testing, as opposed to sending somebody for a serologic test with a reliable biomarker. And so that's more of a trouble that I see without a real good solution that doesn't involve a whole lot of complexity. Older patients we can send to our pulmonary function testing lab and get lung function testing similar to what we can do very well in the older Duchenne population. But unfortunately, from a pulmonary standpoint, we're lacking in good outcomes outside of more subjective clinical measures.
Hey, thank you. And finally, on this topic, Karen,
I would actually echo what everyone has said, and especially point out again that we do need new and improved clinical outcomes and biomarkers to measure these small changes, because we know that we've had a great impact with SMN drugs, but these are going to be smaller changes. And I think biomarkers that actually predict changes in small motor function and fatigue and things like that would not only be useful for SMA, but across the board for a lot of other diseases. So I do think that we still need to figure out what especially older patients need, and to actually find assessments appropriate for them, because a lot of the assessments are also geared toward children, since this is a quote unquote pediatric disease. And I think there's work being done now to find appropriate clinical measures for adult patients, but I think that nothing's been tested in a trial yet.
So, you know, if the 3 points that I seem to be picking up here, one is certainly outcomes and what are we going to measure at the end of the day, and then the biomarkers themselves, and other aspects of, you know, the technologies are coming into play in terms of what kinds of drugs we're looking at, because the various modalities that look like they're being very effective, at least in the relatively short term we're looking at. Getting a little tight on time here now, so I want to move into some questions from the audience, and then I'll ask you for a little bit of a wrap up. I have one question from the audience about what do we know about non-responders?
Can I jump in on that?
Yeah.
The planned outcome, which was going to be a bell-shaped curve of, you know, effect size of this and that, and over a period of time, had to be set aside, and instead a percent responder metric. How many patients got X amount better became the outcome, and it was powerful with, you know, many zeros before the digit. But as a consequence, it opened up the idea that there is such a thing as a non-responder. And so being able to prove the negative, that there is no such thing as a non-responder, was opened up. Now that kind of that kind of stats is really good for cancers where there may be a certain tumor that doesn't respond to your hormone or whatever it might be. But it makes no sense for a genetic disease where we're trying to figure out if there's a benefit to increasing it. So I'd like to emphasize that the choice of statistics has a real impact on later approvals. We can't get approvals for some patients because I haven't proven that it's efficacious because of the small effect size, even though I know it's beneficial to the patients. So this is just, I get real exercised about this stuff. We have to be very careful about this stuff and be aware that we opened up the Pandora's box to a non-responder, which I don't think exists.
I want to come back for a moment to ways of addressing therapies for a second, because I think most of us have been focused in on SM, let's say 2, and it's in the gene itself. What about therapies directed towards protein stabilization, or even you know, mRNA gene delivery, or even use of stem cells in SMA? Can our panel members discuss this, please? Let me start with let's start with on this one with Tom, if we don't mind.
Oh, I was hoping to get a name Karen, because she knows.
Oh, she's funding it. Well, yeah, let's go back to Karen for a second. Karen, what's hot? What's hot that you're looking at right now?
Well, I think just going back to the successes in the field, it seems like SMN splicing, SMN2 upregulation, the drugs we have are pretty effective. And so I think a lot of us are beginning to focus on complementary approaches.
Yes.
The use of stem cells I mentioned as potential for the far off future, maybe not tomorrow, but certainly SMN independent pathways. So I think that might be a wave of the future because they are complementary. And we talked a little before about the combination of SMN operating therapies, which might actually balance the pros and cons of each. So I think that's kind of the SMA Foundation's future goals. So Tom, I'm tossing it back to you.
So certainly on a cell-by-cell basis, we know that any one of these therapies can juice up the amount of SMN above what we think is probably the threshold of degeneration, although you can't really study that in the human animal to know if that's true or not. but we also have concerns about distribution. You know, when we give it intrathecally at the bottom, are we getting up to the brain? When we give it by that is the ASO. When we give a dosing of the AAV in infants, are we really getting broad distribution to all motor neurons up and down the neuroaxis, or is it some sort of patchwork of transformation? One I just started thinking about with the newly approved oral drug is now, for the first time, we're going to depend upon compliance. I mean, I can tell when people don't come in for their spinal tap or didn't get the thing, but you know, there's a tremendous difficulty with compliance in young adults who don't want to take their immunosuppressive drugs and hence lose the kidney that they got transplanted later on. I can see real difficulties in the real world of being able to deliver this stuff over time and checking to make certain that it actually is happening, lest something be lost. There are going to be problems with all of those things. So drug distribution and delivery to the cells that care in time and space and society are going to be issues to study in the future.
Okay, thank you. We're up to our limit at this point, and what I'd like to do is go into some closing thoughts. I'd like to start with first with Hank, if that's okay.
So I think it's an exceptionally exciting time to be in the field of clinical management of SMA. It's changed dramatically in the 20 plus years I've been taking care of patients with SMA. And one of the exciting things is that for many years for pulmonologists, it's been seen as a condition with really no meaningful therapy or hope for future improvement. And at one of our national meetings a couple of years ago, two of the products that are now to market were the pulmonary results were presented, and it was, you could have heard a pin drop. People were completely aghast. And I think thankfully in my community, that's meant that there's a lot more interest in the clinical management. It's critically important because more clinicians are needed to help shepherd the patients that now have disease modifying therapies to reach their potential.
Thank you.
So yeah, that would be my, that's my rosy outlook on the future.
Thanks. Stan?
Oh, well, I'm replicating this in other diseases. I want other diseases to sound like SMA. I think, and we're busy doing it. So that's yes, we need to continue to think about SMA.
So it's not just roses, you have a whole bouquet of roses. You have a bouquet of roses for outlook.
But the other thing that's very much on my mind personally, and it is why I founded my charitable foundation, and Lorem, is one of the really interesting features of genomics. It's teaching us that there are many, many thousands of really unique mutations. And the number of patients with N of 1 into 20 patients in the world with a specific mutation is now in many thousands. And I would say the third thing is the diseases don't affect the patient. They affect the family. They affect the patient, the family, the community. We've improved the survival and the lives of these patients, and we've changed the lives of the families. And so there are lots of desperate families out there, and we need to focus the kind of success, the approaches we took over and over again in those diseases.
Thank you. And I'd like to move to Tom, and then I'm going to save the best for the last, which is Karen, who represents the patient. Yes.
So what a ride. As a personal privilege, I started in 1987, and I went into this field as a hospice doc because there was no hope for these kids. And for a long time, that was true. On the side, I was kind of interested in sciencey things, and boy, did that work. Everything hit right on the mark at the right time. So we've had this extraordinary success from the worst to the top of the peak of being able to say, this is the success that we're going to use for all these other rare diseases that Stan and others are working on. It's fantastic. We have to be able to leverage this success. There are so many things that went right, and we can use those ideas of what went right to understand where things went wrong, where new diseases can be problematic. I think we really have to take advantage of the successes on this one to be able to understand how to develop the next group of drugs, as well as to say, okay, where is it not enough? There are a bunch of things we don't know about SMA. Can we improve muscle? Do we understand why? Where are the unmet needs? What about all those patients that didn't get drug and are now suffering as a consequence? There's still, this is not solved, but it's certainly been transformed, and it's an exciting transformation.
Just one point I'd like to make is, from Tom's comment, is that we probably have to really think about how that gets communicated. The lessons learned gets communicated to the rest of the community so they benefit. Karen, why don't we just move to you, and then we'll wrap up now.
Sure. So as everyone says, this has been a great ride. We have transformative medicines to help SMA patients. But before all of you go off and cure every other rare disease, SMA patients are a demanding group. So families and patients still want you. There's still unmet need in SMA. We still continue working. And in fact, I think with the successes of these SMN dependent drugs, it's actually opened up whole new avenues of ways to treat SMA. We would have never thought to give a muscle drug 10 years ago without stabilization of SMN levels. That wasn't effective. That wasn't effective preclinically. It wouldn't have been effective clinically. And so now that we actually do have SMN levels, we can actually look at other types of drugs, muscle drugs, drugs that target neuronal function. So there's a big new world of drugs out there, and there are patients that still can see significant clinical improvement. And we're talking about the majority of patients who are older and more moderate. And even patients that were treated early on, your type 1s, they may, as they grow older, also need other types of therapies. So there's still a very large unmet need. So don't move on to other diseases. Continue still spend some of your time working on SMA.
Well, thank you so much. I want to thank our panel here for wonderful discussion here, wonderful wonderful outlook today. We have the third approval of a drug, and that one being a small molecule, which is probably almost unheard of with respect to how it's targeting. Thank you so very much for joining us. We really appreciate it. Good day, everybody, and look forward to the next webinar with all. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.